Hi, I'm Terry Bradshaw, tree fruit and viticulture specialist with UVM Extension and Plant and Soil Science Department. I'd like to talk about growing fruit trees in the home orchard. There's some different considerations that you may have when putting tree fruit in a home orchard or home landscape. You typically have a smaller space to work within than you might see in a commercial orchard that could operate on a scale of 5 or 10 or even 100 acres. And trees take up a fair amount of space. So there's some real consideration you need to think about, especially since trees are permanent, semi-permanent anyway, and perennial. You're not going to move these things around. So they do take up a certain spot in your landscape, which requires planning ahead of time. You also need to think about management on an annual basis, meaning the practices that you perform this year can affect the quantity and quality of your fruits for years to come. So that's a real concern to think about, again, in terms of siting and choosing what you're going to produce, and also think about how you're going to manage it down the road. But you can ensure that you have a certain level of quality, a certain type of fruit that you may not be able to find on the commercial market. There's definitely a landscape component. There's nothing better than to look out, off your deck to a landscape of a small home orchard. Definitely beautifies and even adds value to your property. And there's also the chance to really stock up on things if you want to produce a large amount of sauce or dried fruit or cider in a fairly affordable way. Growing tree fruit is a great way to do it. In this lecture, I'm going to outline a number of important factors that are required for successful fruit production. These will include site selection, variety and rootstock, proper planting, ensuring adequate fertility, managing pests, and pruning and training. One critically important consideration of your home orchard site is how cold it gets. This is important because these perennial trees, which will be out in the landscape for multiple years, will need to survive the coldest temperatures that you can expect that they may hit. The USDA plant hardiness zones give you a general idea of how cold it may get, but these don't necessarily show what may happen in a test winter, nor are they really accurate in regards to climate change and how things have changed in recent years. But generally speaking, you can assume that most of Vermont falls within this 4A, 4B range, where you can expect to see 20 to 25 degrees below zero in a typical year. That does not mean we get that every year, but you need to prepare for trees to experience that. There's some warmer sites in the state in the 5 range, which is starting to creep further up into the Champlain Valley than we're seeing on this map and up in the Connecticut Valley. And that may allow you to consider growing peaches and some of the other less hardy crops, but that's always going to be a risk in a cold site. Even more important as far as the production of fruit goes, as opposed to the survival of the tree, is the consideration of spring frosts. So you may be in a site where trees can survive. You may plant, say, a hardy apple tree on a site that rarely sees below 20 below zero Fahrenheit, and that's pretty reasonable to expect that your trees can survive that. However, if you are in a site where cold air settles and you experience spring frosts that don't get anywhere near that cold, we're talking 20 degrees above zero, or even 25 or 28 if it's at the wrong time, you can lose your productive buds that would produce fruit in any particular year. So this is a really, really important consideration for where you decide to site tree fruit in the landscape. So these spring frosts may only be a few hours, but they're an important few hours. They're often caused when there's an inversion or when there's warm air that's packed on top of cold air that allows that settles in low spots, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Some of the examples we need to think about in terms of high risk really references how early particular trees bloom. So apricots, peaches, plums typically bloom a little bit ahead of things like pears and apples and grapes. Apricots in particular are an interesting fruit in that they are typically quite hardy, cold hardy, but they bloom especially early. And so it's very hard to protect those buds, the fruiting buds, from frost because they bloom at a time when frost is very common. We get into pears and apples and grapes. Most of the ones that we grow on good sites have got a bloom period that typically comes out after our usual last frost in the spring. But if you want to really reduce your risk, later blooming varieties like certain varieties like Northern Spy or Rome or some of the specific cider apple varieties tend to bloom even later, sometimes as late as June. And that can lower your risk. And the risk, when we talk about this, is the risk of blossoms being damaged by the cold temperatures. Typically leaves and shoots can sustain a frost and even colder. As we look at trees and how they emerge in the spring, how the buds open and the tissues emerge, the further down this scale we move from a tight bud to a slowly opening bud, and as we look at this chart from these developmental stages 1 through 8, those are the stages as the plants are opening successively and more susceptible tissue is showing. And once you get to bloom, you can see from this chart that about 23, 24 degrees is enough to take out 90% of your potential fruit buds. So that's the critical temperature we talk about. And the earlier that bloom period happens, the more likely that you're going to run into frost problems. I mentioned already, and this is just a good illustration of how to site an orchard in a landscape. It's pretty rare to see orchards located at the bottom of a hill, or I would say down in a narrow river valley, and that's because the cold air moves down slopes. As it moves down, it pushes the warm air up, and that's what we call the inversion. So typically the shoulder of a slope above the valley is where you will get the best frost protection. Down in the bottom of the valley is typically one of the worst places to put, but even where you have depressions in a landscape, you know, a low spot, or if you've got trees that block that cold air from flowing down into the valley, or other structures, you can run into more frost risk issues. You can often see these what we call frost pockets during other times of the year, particularly in the spring and the fall, by looking at where fog forms. Typically the fog is forming in areas where the cold air is settled and allowed the moisture in the air to condense into clouds at the surface. And that shows you that that's where the cold air has settled on that part of the landscape. I would say equally important to, or almost as important as the absolute colds and the degree of frost risk for a particular site is the season length that you may see on that particular site. And this chart is an older USDA hardiness map, but you can see in this section here where we discuss frost-free days. And again, it's a very blunt instrument that's being used to draw a line across a landscape, because cold depressions, frost pockets will have substantially shorter frost-free days than other areas that may be located next to, say, Lake Champlain or on a reasonable slope. So this season length is the time from basically from the last hard frost to the first hard frost to the fall. So it's the number of days that you can get some activity and ripen fruit. It's a little bit different with apples and some other tree fruit that ripen late into the fall, say compared to grapes, in that apple leaves and tissues and even fruit can sustain frosts in the fall. And so oftentimes people are harvesting post-frost. And so you're looking more at kind of a hard freeze. But generally we do talk about the season length in terms of whether or not we can ripen fruit. That's the key here. You could grow fruit successfully, but they may not fully ripen if you don't have a long enough season. On this image, I've taken a map of the state of Vermont, or image of the state of Vermont, and overlaid the frost-free day values taken from historical data from a number of NOAA weather stations around the state. And you can make some real general inferences about this. You can see that up in the Champlain Valley, we have days, frost-free days in the 175 and almost up to 200-day range, particularly when we get right up near the lake. Whereas in the Northeast Kingdom, we may have substantially shorter periods, even in central Vermont. This is Chelsea, Vermont, a station that's no longer located where it is, but for the years that this was located, this station was located at the bottom of a river valley. And so it indicates how much shorter that season is, just because of the topography. And so you can see that we do have substantially longer frost-free day periods, and therefore a greater likelihood to ripen high-quality fruit in the warmer sites of the state. Aside from just the cold air drainage and the topography as it relates to temperature, there's also key considerations for your site in regards to soil, what's underground. Some of the key things to think about for fruits is that the soil needs to be slightly acidic, well drained, and ideally a medium loam, although the first and all of these could be ameliorated to some degree. But if you have serious issues, like in this picture, you can see this was not a normal year and these trees did all survive, but this is a completely waterlogged soil from a year when there were torrential rains from April through the end of June. If this were a situation that you had year after year, you'd have some real problems keeping trees alive on that site. So water drainage is a key part of successful fruit production. Soil acidity and texture. Soil acidity is not that hard to adjust, depending on how many inputs you want to put onto the ground. And so that's can be doable in a relatively short time. Soil texture, loam, silt, sand, clay, that's a little bit harder to manage in the short term, but it is something that can be managed. And we successfully grow tree fruits on everything from sandy soils to clay soils in Vermont. A key part of managing your soil or your site for successful fruit tree production is the pH of the soil. So if you have a pH that's too acidic, you run into issues where you have decreasing availability of certain nutrients. If it's more alkaline, which we do sometimes get in parts of the Champlain Valley where you may have limestone-based soils, we start to run into issues where we have somewhat less availability of certain nutrients. And so the ideal soil range or pH range is in this kind of 6.5 to maybe up to 7 pH range. And that can be relatively easily managed with the application of usually lime, sometimes sulfur if you have acidic soils. So this is a soil test from my house when I bought it some time ago. And you can see just by looking at these relative asterisks, this was considered a pretty low quality soil, low in most of the nutrients. But the real key here we're looking at is this pH number of 5.1. That was a real low issue, a low value that needed to be adjusted. That would immediately change the availability of a number of the nutrients that are required for successful growth. So 1 year later, I don't show the date here, you can see that the nutrient values are back up. I'm at a pH of 6.9, so I'm right at where I want to be. Got a lot more calcium. I've got much better and even up to optimum nutrient availability. And the difference here was I applied 5 tons of lime ash, which is a product of lime and wood ash from commercial wood-fired power plants, per acre. And then I cover cropped that with 25 pounds per acre of buckwheat, and I tilled it in and worked the soil for a year and successfully brought this soil into a reasonable range for fruit production. So this was a good site. You know, the frost drains out well. I'm kind of on the shoulder of a hill. Water doesn't pool, but what I needed to manage was soil pH, and that was successful. Some of the things we can think about in terms of managing soil fertility, again, this is still thinking about how to manage your site, is to add certain materials based upon a soil test. And then ideally cover crop at least a year, preferably 2 years before working a site. And that allows you to loosen up the soil. It allows you to add certain nutrients to the soil. It allows you to make phosphorus available to plants as opposed to have it tied up in the soil. And because we don't like to apply chemical fertilizers directly to the trees, if at all necessarily, it makes more sense to build up our soil organic matter and our pH and our general nutrient profile prior to planting. Another thing that's often done prior to planting is improving our soil drainage. And when I say soil drainage, I'm talking about getting any water to drain away from the site. So we're sort of in this paradox of trees need water, but they can't have too much or they can't have standing water. So there's a few simple things that can be done if you have a site that's, you know, maybe a little bit borderline. One thing we've been doing at the UVM Horticulture Research and Extension Center for a number of years now, every time we plant in orchards, we just run a simple subsoiler down through. And this is just a single shanked plow. It doesn't take a big tractor to run it. And we pull it through the soil, and it breaks up a hard pan layer that we have about 18 inches down or 16 or 18 inches down, and allows water to penetrate into the root zone of the trees. We do this before we plant the trees. You can plant on raised beds. That gets to be a little bit more difficult to do. There's certainly a lot more earthwork that's done, but it can be done with a plow and just to plow in 2 different directions to mound the soil up into an area. It can allow you to kind of address some somewhat poorly drained soils, but it also forces you, if you're driving tractors or otherwise operating equipment, to travel through the depression in between the rows, which is where the water is going to collect. And then commercial orchards often will install drainage tile, and that's not so much done on a home landscape, but it's certainly something that can be done. And there's a lot of good resources out there for how to install and drain your soil. One thing to think about in regards to your site, and this starting to err a little bit into the planting side of things, but it helps to think about, you know, how your site lays, what aspect it has. We prefer to see rows running north-south, and that's because as the sun moves from east to west, it allows the sun to cover both sides of the tree. You have less shading, tree-to-tree shading. But if you've got a steeply sloped site that makes it difficult to run north-south, it's perfectly fine to run east-west. You just may need to put a little bit more space between the trees so they're not shading each other. Another critical piece that I see too often ignored or just not really considered as critical is deer fencing. In every county, in every town in Vermont, I see issues with deer affecting fruit trees. And this is really something that needs to be done. If you're going to put any kind of substantial money into these trees, it makes sense to protect them from day one. If you've got young trees that have, you know, relatively few buds on them emerging in the spring, every time, you know, all it takes is a deer to eat that one emerging bud to basically remove your growth for that entire year. So getting a decent deer fence in, it could either be a multiple strand electric fence like I have in the upper left here. These are relatively inexpensive and quite effective. You might have one of these plastic mesh fences that I'm not a real proponent of, but some people like them. They're certainly much less expensive than some of the steel fences, or even kind of the Cadillac of the high tensile woven wire fence. Another thing people often do is just put single cages around trees. May use chicken wire or sheep fencing and a few posts and make a 6-foot wide circle around the tree. In this cage, you can lift off the tree, and once the tree gets big enough to fill that cage, it's generally big enough that a deer is not going to damage it. But when trees are really young, you can see that a 4th-year tree in my yard looks no larger than the day it was planted, as opposed to one that was planted maybe 20 feet away behind a deer fence. I had substantial growth. So deer protection is absolutely critical in terms of how you select your site and manage and kind of get your site prepared for successful tree fruit production. Tree selection is especially important for orchard production as compared to other types of annual gardening, because you can only do it once. You need to select the right tree, the right variety, the right rootstock, the right species for that site, because you only get one chance to do it. There's a lot of things to consider, but mainly once you've decided what particular species you want, apple, pear, plum, peach, you need to decide what variety and then what rootstock you're going to use. A lot of people don't realize, but apples do not come true from seed. So you can't plant a Macintosh seed and get a Macintosh apple. Trees need to be grafted, and they're typically grafted in a nursery. So you buy a finished tree that contains 2 parts, the rootstock and the variety, or the cultivar. You'll hear me use those words interchangeably sometimes. There's a number of different considerations when you're selecting, and I'm mostly going to talk about the variety, but the rootstock is important as well. For home orchard situations, disease resistance is always my #1 consideration when I make a recommendation. I really don't want to see orchards, home orchards or even commercial orchards, need to be spraying any more than they have to. So if you can select a variety that is already resistant to certain diseases and may completely eliminate the need to spray, then that's a really important consideration. Another important consideration, when you think about how variable the climate is in Vermont, is short versus long seasons. So once we get into what I call inland and upland Vermont, Green Mountains, the Northeast Kingdom, the Central Highlands, kind of the Zone 4, the solid Zone 4 areas and the Zone 3 areas, a shorter season apple, meaning anything that ripens, maybe before, Empire, is more of a consideration. There's a few varieties that require a longer season that just becomes more and more difficult, even in some of the warmer, longer season parts of the state. But then think about, the fun you want to have. What you want to grow is different from what you may be able to find or what a commercial grower may want to grow. I often say, don't bother growing the things that you can easily get from a grower who's a professional and can produce those fruit for cheaper and higher quality than you can. Have fun. Grow some old heirloom varieties. Grow some cider varieties. Grow some varieties that make dried apple rings well. Grow a variety that just has a nice tree form and just has a good looking tree. So those are some of the things you might think about when deciding what type of tree you're going to plant. So here's a few recommendations I have. There's a few varieties that are shorter season length. So when we talk about the short season, these are what you might call, I wouldn't say summer apples. There's none here that are truly summer apples, like yellow transparent, that might ripen at the end of July, and you'll have no problem in any part of the state ripening them. Those usually often have a pretty limited use window, and so if you're going to have just a few trees, I don't typically recommend them. But once you get into mid to late August, there's a number of varieties that would be late summer or early fall apples that you can reliably grow in any part of Vermont. And so these are listed under the short season varieties. These mid-season varieties that I list are they're more in the Macintosh kind of window, the classic post-Labor Day, early September window. And there's some really high quality varieties. Honeycrisp, St. Edmunds, Russet, Arlette, Sweet 16 are just a few that are different from what a lot of producers might, or a lot of consumers might find in the marketplace. Then we start getting into the ones that are a little bit more risky in the shorter season areas of the state. So Fortune, Liberty, Freedom, that's kind of a class. And if you look through nursery catalogs, there's often a chart that shows relative ripening. And when you start to get into this range, that's about as far out as I would go for central Vermont, Northeast Kingdom, shorter season areas. The late season varieties, Northern Spy, some of the different longer season russets, Mutsu, and a lot of the classic cider apples, meaning the European type cider apples, are true late season varieties. You could grow them in central Vermont. You just might not get the highest quality by being able to ripen them to their fullest extent. So I mentioned already that fruit trees are grafted. So you might hear a few different terms. The scion, which is the variety of the tree. It's the piece that's grafted from another variety that you're growing for the fruit. There's a graft union. There's an area where the scion and the rootstock are formed, and that needs to be protected, not necessarily actively protected. I mean, you're not going to put some kind of a cage around that exact zone necessarily. But if there's something that happens at that unit, you can't, you could really run into some issues of the tree dying. So there is that issue, that area. Sometimes early in the life of the tree, that graft union can be brittle until enough tissue forms and it strengthens. So a lot of times we might train a tree, even if it's going to be a big, strong tree, when it becomes fully formed in 5 or 7 or 10 years, we might train it to just a simple stake, just to keep that graft union from getting flexing. And then we have the rootstock, and rootstocks are selected for certain characteristics. Here's a list of some apple cultivars we recommend for Vermont. When I say traditional cultivars, that could be taken a lot of different ways. Traditional in this way, I'm saying traditional varieties that are commercially grown in the state. And this is Macintosh and her daughters, Macintosh, Cortland, Empire, McCowan. They have one downside. All of them are susceptible to apple scab. They have one great upside, which is they're pretty easy to find in the marketplace if you want to buy these fruit. McCowan maybe a little bit less than the others, but certainly Macintosh, Cortland, and Empire are pretty easy to find. And you might question whether or not you even want to grow them if you only got room for a certain number of trees. There's another class of varieties or cultivars that are what I call modern superior cultivars. These are not old varieties. These are newer varieties that were mostly intentionally bred. A few of them were found as wild seedlings and selected, but they really kind of have come out on the marketplace in the last few years when people's interest in fruit quality has really increased. We've seen ever since Honeycrisp hit the landscape, even since Gala hit the landscape 15 years before that, a real interest in fruit quality as opposed to some of the prior considerations which might have had to do with storability and shippability and how easy it was to grow and move a fruit to consumers. So there's a whole group of varieties that are of interest and that I think have great potential for quality. And then there's a lot of varieties that are called heirloom varieties or cultivars, and that's kind of a fuzzy statement. What determines something as an heirloom basically is that it's a really old variety, but old doesn't necessarily mean it's a good variety or a superior variety. But they often are interesting varieties. So some of the ones that are grown in Vermont successfully might be Ashmead's Kernel, Wealthy, Wolf River, Hawkeye Delicious, which was the original Red Delicious apple, which is a red and green striped apple. It's not as pronounced in shape and it has much better flavor than the Red Delicious that most people think of. There's a handful of varieties that were selected in Vermont. For a while, they were hard to find. Now there's some nurseries, particularly local nurseries, where you can find these and other varieties that were selected 100 or more years ago in the state. So that's kind of an interesting thing to maybe plant in your landscape. I talked about disease resistance. There's a whole class of apples, and these would all fit in that what I would call modern superior varieties, or just modern varieties in general, that were bred with an intentional resistance to apple scab. This resistance comes from a species of crabapple that contains a gene that confers essentially complete resistance to the primary disease that affects apples in the Northeast, apple scab. And through traditional breeding and crossbreeding, a whole host of these have come out. And these are just some of the ones that I recommend in Vermont. And I will put a little asterisk in here that two of these, that would be Gold Rush and Enterprise, are pretty long season varieties. I would even say Wine Crisp, add Wine Crisp to that list. And so outside of the Champlain Valley or the Southern Connecticut Valley or down near Bennington, you might have a tough time to ripen those if you're in one of the shorter season areas. But otherwise, these varieties, and especially something like Liberty, Williams Pride, even Freedom, which is one of the older varieties from this group, can very reliably produce fruit with a lot less effort than if you have something that's susceptible to disease. There's a lot of interest now in producing cider, fermented cider, and there's a whole class of fruit, primarily imported from Europe, parts of England, northwestern France, a little bit from Spain, although those varieties are less well known, that both commercial and home growers are growing to produce real specific organoleptic or flavor and aroma characteristics to fermented cider. A lot of interest, a lot of trees that people are putting in the ground, relatively speaking. Kind of expensive trees because I think there's more interest than there is availability of these trees. But I do caution home growers to jump in here too deep because these varieties can have some issues. They bloom late. They can be highly susceptible to fire blight, which can be a devastating disease if you get it. They are extremely biennial, so they have crops one year and no crop the next year. They just have a lot of headaches around them. But if you want to have high quality ciders and you want to put up with the headache and maybe a little more management of producing these trees or these fruits, this is certainly an area of great interest that a lot of people are planting. And I planted a number of these in my own small home orchard many years ago. I don't want to completely ignore stone fruit. I don't cover a whole lot on that because they're not super popular in the state, although I think home growers have a little bit more opportunity to grow some interesting stone fruits because they can accept a little bit more risk. You're not betting the farm by planting cherries or plums or peaches. When I talk about plums or cherries and peaches, I do want to put an asterisk and say peaches and sweet cherries, which are the classic cherries you think about buying from June through August in the big bags in the grocery store and eating fresh. They are questionably cold hardy in Vermont, the peaches and sweet cherries. But sour cherries, tart cherries, you could grow them all over the state. You can grow high quality, even relatively low input. The problem is harvest. Each of these fruit needs to be harvested by hand. Commercially, there's equipment to shake them off the trees and harvest them mechanically. But that's typically done in areas where there's processors that are ready to accept those fruit immediately. So all the bumping and banging that happens through that process is less of a concern. But you could grow some of these varieties, Montmorency, North Star, Meteor, Danube, all day long in Vermont. Some of the plums, I'm not a plum expert. Plums will grow. Plums grow wild in Vermont. There are a number of different varieties, but even more so, there's a number of different species of plums, and it makes their production a little bit more complicated. I will post a link to the to a guide from the University of Maine, where my colleague, Dr. Renee Moran, really is the expert on plums in the Northeast, and can answer that. That will answer a lot more questions than I'm available for. Peaches are kind of the holy grail, I'd say, of stone fruit in Vermont. We know that it can be done. It can be done in a lot of parts of the state, but often not reliably. And you've got to be ready to lose trees. It's just a cold hardiness factor. Another thing is, even if you are in a good site and you can grow peaches, even in the best sites, from central Massachusetts south, and central Massachusetts is kind of the top of the line of where peaches are reliably grown to any substantial acreage in the Northeast. Peaches still can only live maybe 7 or 10 years. I've seen trees live longer, but don't expect it. So they're a little bit more of a gamble, but there are certain varieties that are known or considered to have some superior winter hardiness. And so this is something to consider, but don't bet your whole operation on it. Rootstocks. So I mentioned at the beginning that trees are grafted with a scion and a rootstock, and the rootstock is selected. The rootstocks are clonally propagated mostly. There are some seedling grown rootstocks, and those seedling grown rootstocks produce a full-size tree like you often see in the old farmhouse orchards, 20, 30 plus feet tall, sprawling, take 15, 20 years to produce full size, and can be extremely long-lived. And you likely, many people viewing this, may have seedling trees growing in their landscape that they want to manage, but it's pretty rare to be planting seedlings, at least on any large scale nowadays. There are some trees that are being planted on a rootstock called Antonovka, which is a seedling of a specific apple variety that's a little bit more true to seed and still grows a big cold hardy tree. But more and more people are growing semi-dwarf and dwarf trees, really for the ease of management sake that you get. So as we go from this seedling, if we consider this on the left, 100% of a standard seedling, we move into these semi-dwarf, MM111, M7, things like that, down to M9 full dwarf. And there's a lot of others that have come out since this chart, a lot of the Geneva rootstocks that are mostly being planted by commercial growers. But the main consideration for your rootstock is going to be, is it a standard, a semi-dwarf, or a dwarf tree? And sometimes if you buy a tree, that may be all that you get for information. If you buy one from a garden center, it might just be a tag and just say semi-dwarf Macintosh. And you may have to dig a little deeper to find out what it is, or you may just accept that that's what it is. But if you can actually look at some of the specific rootstocks and select for certain characteristics. For commercial growers, there's a real consideration for the adaptability to soil type, to certain pests, certain soil pests, and then cold hardiness of the rootstock itself. So you've got your tree, and the reason I mentioned this, I'm not talking about planting the orchard yet, but this has more to do with when you source the trees. I often get calls in April, and people say, I want to plant, or May or June, I want to plant an orchard this year, and I realize that they have not ordered the trees yet. At the best situation, you would order your trees 2+ years in advance, and that way you can pick out exactly the variety and rootstock that you want. Nurseries are totally willing to graft a tree for you. But if you get trees in the fall, there's not many people, not many producers in the Northeast who plant in the fall unless the trees are in containers. And so this is where things kind of branch out oftentimes for home producers versus commercial producers. Commercial producers plant a bare root tree. So it's a stick with some roots on it and it's packed in wet sawdust. You got a very narrow window to plant that. It's harvested, it's kept in cold storage. By the time it gets to you, it's perishable. So ideally we plant those early in the spring, but a lot of home producers might buy a tree that comes in a pot, and you can plant that really anytime you can work the soil. If you do plant it in the fall, you're going to have to do some mulching and some extra protection because of the cold that can happen in the freezing and thawing and the heaving. But typically, if you're going to plan to plant in the spring, you're going to order your trees the year prior and get things squared away before you are ready to put the trees in the ground. So planting these trees it's fairly simple, but there's a few important things to think about that'll get you on the road to success. So first, never let your roots dry out, particularly if you buy bare root trees. We typically get a big stock tank and we put our trees in the water for upwards of 12 hours. We might put them in the night before we're getting ready to plant, and we store them in the water while we're digging the holes and planting. We dig a nice big hole. We don't cheap out. There's a saying that you don't put a $10 tree in a $1 hole, but you don't need an excavator to dig massive holes. You can see these holes were dug with an auger on the back of a tractor. You can do the same thing with a shovel, but you need to dig a decent sized hole that you can fit the whole root system in without compromising it. I typically don't recommend that people mix any amendments really into the soil. Maybe a little bit of compost to give them some extra boost, but I don't recommend any chemical fertilizer in the planting hole. You can just burn your roots too easily. Sometimes if you've got these stray roots that stick out and are hard to put in the hole, you may prune them off, and you can prune a few of them as needed. It won't hurt the tree. But remember, those roots are what's going to provide the sustenance to that tree as it starts to wake up and early in its life. So try to protect those roots. When you plant, make sure that graft union, and that's marked by this tag on the tree here, is 2 or 3 inches above the soil line. This is important because if you have any kind of a clonal rootstock, a semi-dwarf or a dwarf rootstock, and the roots and the graft union gets buried, the scion will set roots, and when it sets roots, it will revert to a full-size tree. And this is something you see sometimes in commercial orchards. If a tree settled maybe, or if the graft union was planted at the soil line or somehow got buried, you'll see the one tree that's larger than everything else. And so typically we try to keep them 2 or 3 or even up to 6 inches above the soil line. Often trees will settle in the first few weeks after you plant them. So just keep an eye on that. Pack the soil, stake them, and then ideally get a mouse guard or some kind of protection on the base of that tree, certainly by the end of the summer. This is a tender time for these trees. That root system, or I should say that lower trunk, is the entire conductive pathway between the roots and the top of the tree, and so if there's any damage, you could lose the tree. So this is an important time to protect that with a stake and maybe a mouse guard or a piece of window screen or even a commercially available wrap. Mineral nutrition of fruit trees is critical to the long-term productivity and even the vegetative growth and the general health of the tree over time. This is an important consideration for perennial crops because the nutrients that you're managing this year can affect production next year and for other years moving forward. The specific mineral nutrients to think about with tree fruit really aren't that much different than with other annual crops, although there's some that you need to think of maybe a little bit more importantly. So something like boron is pretty critical for tree fruit and is often a limiting element for fruit production in the state of Vermont and in a lot of places with weathered soils. On the other hand, nitrogen is often less of a concern in Vermont, particularly soils that have reasonably high organic matter, to the point where many commercial growers never even apply nitrogen fertilizers. And then we've got our cations, potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are pretty commonly applied, but need to be applied based upon having an understanding of the status of the tree and the soil through testing. Now, compost is often applied, not applied to the level that it is maybe in annual crop systems. But if you think about what makes up compost, for the most part, is decayed vegetative matter. And therefore, it typically contains a relative balance of nutrients that the trees need. We often apply before planting a pretty heavy load right down the row. We've got a nice spreader that allows us to kind of mound that up and then till it in. So we're basically increasing the organic matter throughout the strip. But if you also see throughout my slides, my soil is especially sandy. So I have low organic matter content, and therefore I really need to add as much organic matter or a high level amount of organic matter. Some folks who have organic matter in the maybe 3 to 5 or 6% range, this might not be as critical. When you have established trees, you can apply fertilizers to maintain growth and to improve the long-term productivity of the plant. Some general rules of thumb, if you don't have a soil test handy, is that when the growth starts, so what we call green tip or maybe half-inch green, when you start to see leaves that are emerged from the shoots, from the buds, and therefore the plant is growing and needs nutrient. You don't want to apply before this because you're just wasting it. You can think about applying a certain amount of nitrogen and potassium. Nitrogen only if you have either low organic matter soils or if you're not getting adequate growth, but certainly potassium. And what we recommend for either of those as a baseline, now the better thing to do is to go do a test and assess what's actually in the plant, but 0.1 pound per year of age up to about 10 years of age. So if we're talking about a 5-year-old tree, maybe a ½ pound of potassium, of actual potassium. So if we have a ½ pound we want, and we have a fertilizer that contains 20% potassium, we may put 2.5 pounds of potassium on that potassium fertilizer of 20% K, 20% potassium to get that. But the idea we really want to look for as far as these kind of macronutrients is good terminal shoot growth. So the shoots, the annual shoots that grow every year, you want to get about 1 foot to 1.5 feet of growth. If you get much more than that, you probably have too much fertilizer. We don't apply any nitrogen fertilizer after mid-June, and that's because you run the danger of forcing that or encouraging that tree to grow too late into the season, not hardening off, and therefore you run into some issues with winter hardiness in the season following. Potassium fertilizer you can put down pretty much any time that the roots are active. So we might apply right up until just before leaf fall, and it can still be taken up by the tree. Notice I don't mention phosphorus. Phosphorus is rarely limiting in Vermont soils. If it is, your soil test will say so, but most of the time we don't. I've never applied phosphorus fertilizers to any of our trees, but it doesn't mean that a certain site might not be low, but that's fairly rare in most of Vermont. So I mentioned the cations, so calcium and magnesium, also potassium is one. They are commonly deficient, and so a lot of times I recommend that people kind of keep a low rate applied of either of these. So if you're going to use a potassium fertilizer, sulfomag, which is available in both organic and non-organic forms. It's a mineral salt, provides sulfur, potassium, and magnesium. And the potassium and magnesium are applied in roughly the similar amounts to what they're needed by the tree. So as long as your soil is not totally out of whack for those two, in terms of the balance of those two nutrients, using sulfomag as your magnesium and potassium fertilizer can be very useful. I mentioned calcium nitrate. That's an inorganic or a synthetic fertilizer that does provide a certain amount of calcium, but usually lime is where you would get most of the calcium that your tree needs. The thing with lime is it takes a long time for it to work. So if you have a calcium deficiency in the tree or in the soil, something that might be a little bit quicker, like a calcium nitrate or even foliar applications of some different calcium products, may help with some of these things, like this breakdown we see. This is probably a calcium or even a boron deficiency that you see. Some of the micronutrients can be deficient, and to really figure this out, you need to do either a soil or, better yet, a plant tissue analysis, and this can be done through the UVM Agriculture Testing Lab. Most of the time, if you're applying compost or other organic matter, these will be balanced, aside from maybe boron. Boron is one of the ones that is often weathered out of our soils, but you really should apply carefully so that you're not overdosing these, because there can be some issues with over application of these micronutrients. Typically with boron, because it's so commonly deficient, I do often recommend that growers think about it if they're having poor fruit set problems. Boron is usually applied in the range of like a pound or two per acre, so it's not a lot applied, and that's hard to calculate. With a typical orchard that may have at the typical home orchard spacing of maybe 10 feet between trees and 15 feet between rows or something like that, you can figure on 200 trees per acre. And if you were to apply 2 pounds of boron, that means 0.01 pounds per tree, which is not a lot. And the boron is often that growers apply is the same stuff you can buy at the grocery store, borax. So you can get that, and you can calculate pretty easily a hundredth of a pound based upon, a 10% or 20%, depending on what strength you get. It comes out to a few teaspoonfuls. And that might be a decent tonic to apply to the soil, every other year, maybe in a watering can. Mix it in water and just water it onto the plant roots. That's the one that kind of stands out. Water's not a nutrient, but it sure does move nutrients. In much of Vermont, we don't worry about watering. In fact, we in the Northeast often have too much water. But if you're going to invest in an orchard, especially if you're going to invest in a high density or in a dwarf orchard where the trees have pretty small root systems that don't extend outward or deeply into the soil, it can be really important to apply irrigation on some regular basis. There's a lot of different ways to calculate how much water you need. A tree needs 5 or 10 gallons of water per week, roughly. That would be for a semi-dwarf tree. And a simple drip irrigation system is a great way to set that up. Be careful if you do have an irrigation system that you don't overwater. If you see any pooling, if the soil never dries out, then you're certainly overwatering. And there's a number of ways you can measure it, but it shouldn't be that difficult. Typically on our sandy site, and you can see the sand again from our soil, we might run the water for 8 hours a week, 2 4-hour stints, and that's in a very dry site. So in a typical, I don't know if there is a typical soil in Vermont, but in a heavier soil, slightly heavier soil than we have, you might run it just if it hasn't rained in 7 days, run it for a few hours. So this is an important thing. Back to thinking about how you plant and how you select trees and lay things out. pollination is an important consideration. Every blossom needs to be pollinated before it can produce a fruit, for the most part. Well, not even for the most part. I'd say that is true for all fruit. Some species of fruit can pollinate themselves, so we call that a self-fertile plant. Most are self-infertile and require another variety planted nearby with a similar bloom period that allows pollen to transfer from one tree to the next. There's a few things to think about, considerations. Mostly in Vermont or in the Northeast, we have enough trees nearby, whether it's a wild crabapple tree, your neighbor's tree, that there typically is not a huge issue with not having sufficient pollinizers. Those are the other tree that you have. But if you plant 6 mutsu trees and nothing else, you might run into some issues. If you plant 6 mutsu trees and 1 honeycrisp, you could have some issues with the honeycrisp because mutsu is about the only one I can think of that's commonly planted. Is uniquely set up in that its pollen is sterile. So that's one thing to consider, but you want to have trees that can provide pollen back and forth to each other. I say they need a friend to play with, and that friend needs to bloom at the same time. So excuse me, so that's an important consideration. Just as it's important to have a compatible pollinizer tree nearby to provide pollen that will allow for the development of fruit, it's also important to have pollinators, bees typically, but other insects, and sometimes wind, to help move that pollen from one tree to another. So there's a few terms we use when we talk about the biology of fruit set. Pollination is simply the movement of pollen from one tree to another. And again, this requires having bees or other agents that will move that pollen. But once that pollen moves, and that typically, particularly if you're relying on honeybees, good weather during bloom is pretty critical. Good weather being warm, dry, sunny, which is more conducive to bee flight. So a lot of times we'll see poor pollination might happen if bees aren't flying during the bloom window. So if it's real windy or cloudy or rainy during that window, we can see low fruit production. But it doesn't take very long. It only takes a few hours of good weather if you've got a decent pollinator population, which most parts of Vermont do have a reasonable number of pollinators, assuming they're near some kind of a diverse habitat. So typically pollination isn't a huge problem unless there's a weather-related issue. Another weather-related issue that can happen is that the pollen, once it's transferred over to another blossom, that pollen is essentially very similar to a seed, and that seed needs to germinate and send its tube down to the ovary and fertilize the ovary, and that's where meiosis and all the biological processes start to form a fruit. If it's cool, cloudy, rainy, mostly cool and cloudy, the rainy isn't as much of an issue during that post-pollination window, cool being 55 degrees or lower, you can run into some issues of what we call low fruit set. And those are harder to manage on a basis. There's not much you can change about that, but that could be one reason why you may have few fruit in a cool, cloudy, wet spring year. On the flip side, this is something that a lot of growers don't think about, home producers don't think about, but commercial growers absolutely do. And this is one of the major practices that sort of divides the amateur from the professional grower, is the concept of thinning fruit. So a tree will typically have maybe 5 to maybe 10 times more blossoms on it than a grower might want fruit at the end of the season. The tree hedges its bets. produces a pretty good flush of blossoms, and only a certain number of those make it through the full season. But if a large number of set fruit, pollinated blossoms that convert into fruit, developing fruit, are left on the tree later into the season, I'd say early summer and up through maybe July 15th or so, it starts to tax the resources of the tree to produce buds for the following year. So we commonly thin fruit off, especially in the heavy years. So those years when you've got a large bloom, most of your non-managed or minimally managed trees are biennial. They produce a flush of fruit in 1 year, typically in the odd numbered year, and less fruit and even no fruit in the even numbered year. So we will come in early after fruit set, 8 or 10 millimeter size, when the fruit are about the size of a dime, and remove a large number of the fruit. And the easy way to do this is to break those clusters down to a single fruit. There's some math and there's some other things you can do to try to optimize that, but the simplest way to do it is to just hand thin down to a single fruit, maybe 4 to 6 inches apart on the branch. And that'll give you a reasonable crop load, as we call it, that'll allow for high quality fruit. There's fewer fruit, so the ones that remain are larger and typically are able to ripen better, so they typically have better flavor and better quality. And you actually don't lose in volume because fewer larger fruit adds up to as many bushels as a larger number of much smaller fruit. Typically the goal, if you can, is to keep what we call the king fruit, which is the central blossom, the fruit that forms from the central blossom of the cluster. But sometimes that one might be damaged by insect or disease. And so as you thin, it's more important to look for undamaged fruit than it is for just the largest fruit. And then I just want to make one mention about a situation that happens that we call June drop. So the tree naturally sheds a number of fruit post bloom, usually 4 to 6 weeks after bloom. Don't be surprised when this happens. This is a normal occurrence. And the thinning that's typically done is in addition to what you might get from June drop. And again, on a home basis, this can be done when the fruit are 8 or 10 or up to maybe 3/4 of an inch across. And what you're trying to do is get the fruit off the tree early enough that the tree can then put its resources into producing next year's fruit buds. Pest management is one of the trickiest aspects to managing tree fruit. It's one of the main reasons why it's so tough to do on a commercial scale organically, because we have perennial crops. Perennial crops mean perennial pests. And this is really a long-term kind of knowledge-intensive aspect of fruit production that can really complicate things. So it's an important thing to think about as you get ready to consider planting or maintaining an orchard. Again, orchards are perennial. These trees planted at my farm at UVM are going to be there. They were there in 2007 when we planted it. They were there in 2017 when they were fully producing, and maybe when this picture was taken, and they'll be there even beyond that. And so one of the key practices that's used in management of pests, crop rotation, we can't use. That's taken off the table. And so we need to think about things a little bit differently and shift our thinking in terms of how we're going to manage pests in this landscape. There are a number of primary pests, and when I say pest, I'm talking about any biological agent that can reduce the quantity or quality of your crop. So that kind of settles down into diseases and insects, or I'll say arthropods, because there's 1 or 2 here that aren't insects but still have lots of legs. And there's a few that really drive the bus on this. Apple scab, I've already mentioned, is the primary disease issue in the Northeast. And managing for apple scab often dictates how we manage for the other fungal diseases. The other one that we think about that's a little bit different, and it's kind of a unique situation, is fire blight. Fire blight, if you have a susceptible orchard, susceptible sites, susceptible varieties, a history of the disease, is very different because it's a bacterial disease, totally different scope of management. And so you don't usually think of these two in the same, in the same mindset. But scab is really what drives the bus on the management of diseases, but even of insect management. Because if a grower is going to go out, whether they're commercial or home orchard, and they're going to maybe apply a spray, you know when you need to apply your apple scab sprays, and so that'll often time when you need to manage your other pests as well. There's a few. These are some of the bigger ones. Plum curculio and codling moth is becoming more and more of an issue. I would say those two, and along with apple maggot that I don't mention here, but I'll mention a little bit later, are kind of the three main ones. But curculio, codling moth, if you're managing for those two, you're probably going to manage for the others, except for the ones that I don't really care so much about, and I'll mention that in a minute. So let's look at a disease cycle. This helps us understand kind of some of the tactics we might take to manage for this particular disease, apple scab. And the thing about disease cycles is you can start them anywhere, but let's start at this spot here where the fungus is overwintering, so next March or even right now underneath the snow, the fungus is overwintering on the leaves, laying on the soil. Over the course of the winter and early spring, the infections on those leaves start to develop spores. The fungi develops its spores, and this is when the sexual reproduction phase of the fungus is occurring, is during the winter, and it's primed so that when the trees bud out in the spring is right about when the spores are mature and ready to infect. In fact, the disease models that we use to time and predict and manage this disease on a commercial basis assumes the whole thing is based upon the spores being ready when the trees break bud, and we enter the date that the buds open as the time that we sort of start the clock on this. So spores are released, physically ejected from these little spore pockets of the leaves, and when they're wetted, so you need a wetting event, shoots the spores up. The spores land on leaf tissues. If the leaf tissues remain wet, and that's a pretty key part of this cycle, then the spores are able to penetrate the leaf tissue and start infection. And if that infection is allowed to carry on, those infections may continue to produce asexual spores and spread that disease throughout the season. So if we can manage right in this window, if we can prevent this primary phase before that asexual reproduction happens, and we can manage for the spores that are just in the leaf litter, until the leaf litter is done shooting spores, we can be done managing apple scab for the season. So how do we do this? There's a few key areas to manage. Number one is the scab resistant variety. If you can grow something like a Liberty, shown here on the upper left, as compared to a Macintosh, shown here on the upper right, you will remove the threat of scab from the equation. However, that means that you now need to think about some of the other diseases that your management of scab was also going to manage for. Main one might be cedar apple rust, is one that I often see that sort of starts out as a secondary pest, but becomes a more important pest if you're not managing for scab. Orchard sanitation can be effective, but it's hard to do. I don't know a lot of people who would do this on a small scale. But in theory, if you remove every fallen leaf from under the tree, post leaf drop, or even in the spring prior to the buds emerging or breaking, you're removing the inoculum. You will remove the spores that will infect. This assumes that you don't have nearby trees, on a neighbor's property or elsewhere. It can be a little bit tougher to do, but it has been done, and there are tactics that are done commercially to maybe not get 100% of the leaves out, but to reduce things enough that you could shift your management. In a lot of cases, you wind up applying some kind of a fungicide spray to manage for this and other diseases. There's a couple different routes to go. I call elemental, or this would be organically certified sprays of sulfur and or copper. And typically, as far as copper goes, copper is only applied right as the trees are starting to break bud. It can cause damage to developing fruit. It can ruin the skin surface and disfigure the fruit. So a lot of times we put copper away after the buds start to emerge. Although there are some newer copper products that I recommend with caution that have lower rates of copper. Therefore, they're maybe a little bit less effective, but they're also a little bit less damaging. But most home growers who stick to an organic type of schedule or organic friendly schedule would apply some kind of a sulfur, usually a powdered elemental sulfur. There's a number of synthetic materials, Captan being the primary one that's available to home orchardists. You can, if you were to purchase home orchard spray mix, that's the standard fungicide that's included in there. And if you were to maintain coverage from green tissue through fruit set or so after bloom, and when the fruit are set, they're about an inch across, and you know that they've made it through, that will protect you from apple scab. And if you use one of these materials, particularly the synthetic, the Captan, which has got a little bit more efficacy, you will probably manage all of the disease that would really be of concern, aside from maybe fire blight, if that's a risk to you. Cedar apple rust, as I mentioned, is more of a concern, especially if you are growing a scab-resistant variety, so you're not spraying for apple scab. So there's a few varieties that are particularly susceptible to this, and some of the scab-resistant varieties like Crimson Crisp or Wine Crisp do seem to be quite susceptible. A lot of cases, it's just an annoyance, and so the number one thing I would say is just tolerate it. But in some cases, this can defoliate a tree. If you have a tree that is prone to cedar apple rust, there are some materials. Unfortunately, the organic ones I have not found work very well. So you may just need to, tolerate the disease more if you're sticking to an organic program. But mancozeb, which you can find as manzate, and some of the sterile inhibitor fungicides you might be able to find at some of the more specialized garden outlets, can be effective. I would just look for cedar apple rust specifically on the label of the material if you're going to choose to spray your way out of it. Okay, insects. So plum curculio, I mentioned, is one of the ones that sort of drives the insect program. And if you manage, when you manage for this, you will probably be managing for most of your early season pests. One thing I'm skipping over is when I say early season, I'm not saying pre-bloom. There's a few pests that some commercial growers might manage prior to bloom. Typically, they cause cosmetic damage. So something like tarnished plant bug or European apple softfly, you may spray prior to bloom to try to bring those populations down. I don't have any interest in home growers, applying early season pesticides right before bees are about to start flying, just for cosmetic reasons. So I skip right over that. So when I say early season, I'm talking post bloom, bees have come and gone, and now you've got developing fruits 8 to 10, 12 millimeters in size, about the time you'd be hand thinning, that you want to start protecting. And so that's when plum curculio starts to become active. They actually get into the trees a little bit earlier, but they're just waiting in the wings to start to puncture the fruit and lay eggs in these little punctures. And what can happen is in a bad infection or a bad infestation, especially on plums, as they lay their egg in that little crescent-shaped scar, the larva hatches, burrows down, eats the seeds, and the seeds are producing hormones that tell the tree to produce the fruit. So what winds up happening is the fruit will drop off, and you'll see a complete loss of fruit, especially on plums. That's more common on plums. So what do? We typically apply some kind of an insecticide treatment in the petal fall, or maybe a few days, maybe a week or so after that, until about the middle of June. So most years you can do this with 2, maybe in a wet year or cool year, or it's kind of drawn out, maybe 3 sprays. There's a number of materials that are out there. I'm not going to recommend specific ones right now. The home orchard spray certainly contains a material that's effective against these guys, but there's one that is worthy of specific consideration called Surround, which changed the ability to grow apples organically in the Northeast. We used to say that apples were, I wouldn't say impossible, but extremely difficult, or sort of the holy grail of organics, mostly because of plum curculio. There weren't good materials, and some of the materials that were being used that aren't even allowed anymore were pretty toxic, whether they were organic or not. There were some pretty strong materials that were needed to affect that pest. This material is kaolin clay. It's just a ground clay applied at a very high rate to basically whitewash the trees. What you see here in this picture is late season, so this is just what's stuck to the leaves. The fruit are almost bare because this is mostly done prior to the fruit sizing up. But you maintain this clay on the whole tree, whitewash the tree with it from that same window, petal fall or even late bloom, to try to get the residue built up through mid to end of June. What this clay does is when insects walk across it or fly through it, it irritates them. It plugs up their breathing pores. It doesn't kill them, but it sends them off somewhere else. This has really changed the ability to grow fruit organically. It's kind of difficult stuff to work with. It's dusty, it's powdery. You're working with fairly high rates of it. But for people who want to stick to an organic program, it really has been a game changer. So if you were to manage during that window, your plum curculio, and then any of the others that come in along with that, so this would be your first generation of codling moth, and then maybe some of your other secondary pests, then the next thing you've got to think about is the summer pests. And so there's usually a break between that petal fall window and midsummer, when you get a second generation of codling moth, when you get some of your leaf rollers that eat the surface of the fruit. And so typically we're looking at 3 kind of action times. Petal fall, like I already talked about, July 1st or so. And you can time these with some more complicated models, and you'll need a weather station and traps and whatnot. That's kind of 2.0. It's kind of above and beyond this. But if you were to apply maybe a petal fall application, July 1st or 4th or somewhere in there, and oftentimes that might be enough to get the bulk of them, so that the rest of the damage that comes in is just an annoyance and not a major crop loss. There's one material, BT, which is an organically certified, very safe material that works well against leps or caterpillar larvae. So when we say worms, they're not really worms, but it does not work against codling moth. Just the feeding activity, the way that they behave, prevents them from getting a high enough dose of BT. But BT is very effective against some of these surface feeding Lepidoptera larvae. So it is one of the ones that we often recommend kind of adding into that midsummer spray, because it's so safe. You can spray it around bees, you can spray it around kids and goats and whatever, but it's very, very specific in its activity. So some pests I mentioned you can trap for to determine whether or not you have a population that's worth spraying. Tarnished plant bug, European apple sawfly, we do trap for them on a commercial scale, and in a lot of cases that has allowed us and growers to realize that the problem wasn't as big as we thought, and that's why a lot of those early season pesticide applications have sort of gone by the wayside. Codling moth is often trapped mostly to determine if you've even got a problem. These traps can be found from garden centers, from some of your more specialized outlets. They have a little pheromone attached to them, the codling moth in particular, that attracts a male moth to it, so it really draws them in and gives you a good sense of what the population is. It's a little bit complicated to just figure out this trapping thing quickly. So, there's more that can be determined mostly by talking to and looking at materials from extension, not just from Vermont, but from around the Northeast, where we have a similar pest complex, and really getting schooled up on how best to implement trapping in your orchard. There is one insect that you can actually trap out of the orchard. And that, by trap out, I mean you can actually hang enough traps that you can successfully have the insects land on the trap and get stuck and not land on your fruit. And that's apple maggot. That's a fly that is active from late June through August or so. I don't see a lot of damage after August or so, but even though they still fly. And if you were to put 1 to 4 of these, and in a big tree, it might take 4 traps per tree. So you can wind up with a lot of traps. They're coated with this sticky coating, like very sticky coating that you have to keep maintaining throughout the season. And the flies land on them and they get stuck and they can't land on your fruit. These are commonly available. A lot of home orchards use them from a number of different suppliers. So this is a successful trap out strategy that can be used against that particular pest. There are some models, and I'm just going to mention it briefly. If you want to get into pest management 2.0 and you want to start integrating traps and weather models and whatnot into your management, I specialize in this, and I help provide this service to growers around the state, and homeowners can do this, but you can really dial in very specific management timings based upon weather and scouting and just observations in the orchard. So that's kind of a 2.0, but niwa.cornell.edu, you can just Google NIWA, Network for Environment and Weather Applications, and learn more about it. But this is an expert system that's used throughout the Northeast. It's based out at Cornell, and it really can be help to dial in. But you've got to already have kind of a base understanding of what you're doing in the orchard before sort of implementing this next piece. If you are going to spray, I'll just talk about this kind of briefly, but it's just something I need to hammer home. I see more issues of what I would say dangerous behavior from untrained home producers than I do from commercial producers who are trained and understand how to handle materials that are, at the end of the day, designed to kill certain pests. And so there's a safety consideration to take in mind. So read your label, wear any personal protective equipment that is on the label, and really pay attention. There's a lot of responsibility that's entailed if you are going to apply sprays to your orchard. So I'm going to sum everything up here at the beginning that I've just stated into this short little chart. We can look at inoculum reduction early in the season by pruning out fire blight, raking up leaves for apple scab. I didn't talk about mites because they really are a secondary pest. If you spray a lot of insecticides, broad spectrum insecticides that kill the things that eat mites, then you could have mites, which are tiny, tiny spider-like arthropods that feed on that suck the juices out of the leaves. These are very rare on a home orchard situation. There's a saying we have: the more you spray, the more you have to spray. So sometimes for mites, people will apply a dormant oil spray, but even then, I find that's not really necessary unless you start seeing real issues with them. And you might see them if you've got browning leaves midsummer, or you can see tiny, tiny red eggs or even moving mites on the base of the leaves. But that's more for a commercial situation. Fire blight, I've only touched on it because it's very specific and site specific and variety specific, but it's typically pruned out early season. But really, kind of the early to mid season is when the bulk of your management happens. So you might be spraying for apple scab in that pre-bloom window, and then post-bloom you're managing for apple scab. Some of the other diseases that are being managed while you're spraying for scab, and then really just a couple of windows when you're thinking about codling moth, plum curculio, and then you're thinking about apple maggot later in the season. So you can look a little bit more closely into each of these pests as you are managing your orchard, but these are kind of the main things you got to think about. In summary, these are some of the main issues that home fruit producers have with having a successful crop. Why don't we have fruit? You might be winter kill of your fruiting buds, and there's not much you can do aside from not planting trees down in frost pockets or in cold locations. Maintain your tree health with good nutrition. Pruning, which we'll talk about a little bit later, pest management will improve the general vigor and health. But if you've got a truly cold situation, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Spring frost at bloom. These are terribly frosted buds that are not going to produce any fruit. And again, what can you do about it? Avoid low-lying areas, avoid frost-prone areas. But nutrition management can be helpful. Sometimes growers will apply boron and maybe zinc at low rates. You can buy both of these at garden centers, and there'll be a labeled rate on there. If they're applied prior to bloom, these are two nutrients that can help to boost the short-term cold hardiness of blossom tissues or ovary tissues. Some say that fish oil sprays at bloom might help. I'm not so sure about that, but sometimes people feel like that doing something is better than doing nothing if you see a frost coming. But a frost is a pretty solid way to ensure that you won't have fruit that year. Pollinators. The key issues that might happen might be not having another variety, pollinizer variety, so you can plant another variety nearby, or even graft a limb on of a different variety to provide pollen to that tree. You might not have enough bees in your location. Say you live in the suburbs and you've got a non-natural environment. Then you may want to think about bringing in some kind of bees. But most of Vermont has a decent population of different diverse pollinators. You've got to look careful because a lot of these guys are pretty small. The native pollinators who evolved to pollinate trees, not so much apples because they're not native to here, but certainly serviceberry and some of the other native malus species and other blooming species. But more commonly, it's a weather thing again. Cool, cloudy, wet bloom weather often leads to poor pollination issues. And you can tell if you see fruit that start to form and then start dropping off. If you cut into those and you see no seeds, that's an indicator that the tree started to produce the fruit, but wasn't able to keep doing it because there was no seed to produce the hormones to trigger it to produce the fruit. Nutrition. It's important if you've got certain things like a potassium deficiency, kind of gross nutrient mineral deficiencies, to conduct some soil and or leaf analyses from an agricultural testing lab. The UVM agricultural testing lab will do these, and they'll also provide recommendations based upon the values that are produced in the test. And keep an eye on these fruiting nutrients: boron, zinc, copper to some degree, but potassium and nitrogen. And just be careful. I did recommend applying boron, but make sure you don't put too much on. Pest damage. Here's an example of what I would say is a pretty acute infestation of European apple sawfly. In a normal or a typical infestation, only a few of the fruits will be damaged in this way, where if you were to look at these from the side, the larva went right in and ate the seeds out, and both of these fruit will probably drop off. So we sometimes see plum curculio and sawfly infestations can cause high levels of fruit drop. I've never seen sawfly drop a whole crop, and I've managed a lot of trees organically with a lot of infestations. So sometimes we say this could help you with your thinning. Plum curculio really could. So managing for those early season pests can be really important to making sure you have fruit a few months later for harvest. Pruning and training are critical practices for the successful management of orchard crops, whether in a home landscape or commercially. Some of the things to think about, which is a little bit different from annual crops, where you've got one season, you grow as much of a plant as you can, and then it's gone. With a perennial crop, you're maintaining a balance between vegetative growth and fruiting production. And if you have low fruit production, you can have excess vegetative growth and vice versa. So as we prune, we're typically looking to balance out the framework of the tree. So you want to have a strong structure of the tree just so that it can hold its crop up. You want to promote wood that will support annual flower formation. You want to develop a tree canopy that allows for good light and air and sun penetration, so the canopy dries out and the fruit get adequate sunlight and adequate photosynthesis. And then just for ease of management, it's really hard to pick and manage a tree that hasn't been pruned. A key concept to think about in terms of pruning is, again, getting light into the center of a tree. So if we look at this kind of gross generalized visualization of a tree, about the outer third has more than 50 or 60% of full sunlight, of photosynthetically active sunlight, and that's where you're going to have the most productivity. As you get further and further, and we would say, once you get more than about a meter, 3 feet into the canopy of a tree, you start to get into an area where there is, less than a quarter or so, or a third or so of the total potential sunlight that could be falling on those leaves getting in there. And that's when you start to run into issues where you don't have enough sunlight to produce enough photosynthesis to produce good production of fruit buds, number one, and even if you do get fruit buds, fruit quality. So a few rules of thumb. Fruit size can be greatly affected by how much sunlight hits the leaves that are directly surrounding those fruit, those spur leaves, we call them. Those are produce the photosynthate that goes straight into that fruit. So if you got less than half, 50% of the sunlight getting into those leaves, you're going to have small fruit. Oftentimes you'll see poorly colored fruit on the interior of a tree, and that's because the fruit needs to have sunlight hit the skin. To basically, the skin essentially produces a sunscreen of sorts that turns the fruit red, and that produces better flavors, better ripening, more firmness, just a higher quality fruit. And then especially important is the development of next year's fruit spurs requires a certain amount of light. And so if you don't have the light getting into the center, you're not going to get production. And so we often see large, poorly pruned trees or just overly large trees where the fruit production pushes further and further out in the canopy to the edges where they're out in the sunlight. Some important tools that you'll use when you're pruning. They've got to be high quality. They've got to be professional grade, I would say, if you're going to be doing this with any regularity. A cheap set of loppers is going to do as much damage to you as it is to the tree, with making poor quality cuts and also just poor ergonomics as you're using them. I typically will carry just a few tools: a set of loppers, a single hand saw, maybe a pole saw. Sometimes I'll use a power pruner, which is a chainsaw on the end of a pole for bigger trees, but most homeowners probably wouldn't use such a thing. But the key here is to learn how to sharpen your blades and invest in good quality tools that are going to do the job. Okay, this is critical. This is absolutely important when we think about pruning trees. There's two basic types of cuts. There's heading back and thinning out. and I will redraw these lines, but a heading back cut is where you cut off a section of a branch and leave a stub. Thinning out is where you cut off the section of a plant back to where it grew from. So remove an entire branch. And we really discourage heading back cuts for most fruit trees. So again, heading back, you're removing part of a branch. Here's an example right here where we cut it off. Last year, what was done is it was probably cut off at this point. And what happens, there's a few things that can happen. You're removing your terminal bud, which changes the hormone flow in that branch. That terminal bud produces a hormone that basically guides the growth of the branch, reduces the number of these side shoots that come out, and allows for spurs to form instead. And the spurs are what are where you get your fruit. So if you were to lop off a section of a branch and remove that hormone that's inhibiting these shoots, now you get multiple shoots that start to grow out, which can make these, for these kind of witch's broom sort of really messy branches, that if you multiply that out, cause a lot of shading because of all the excess foliage that comes out of there. And it also reduces the number of fruit buds that are on the tree. You also, particularly when you've got a stub that can be growing like this, that stub may die back. And when you have any dead tissue in the tree, that is just an area for disease, particularly things like black rot, to come in that could affect the tree. So you want to keep, the chance of having dead tissue in the tree down to an absolute minimum, or I would even say to zero. As opposed to a thinning out cut. You can see this set of loppers is cutting this branch completely off at the trunk. So you take the whole shoot off. You're not shifting that ratio of terminal buds, the bud at the very tip of the shoot, that produces that hormone, to the side buds that are affected by that hormone. So you don't get as much of a shift in the production of that tree from fruiting to vegetative wood. Just here's a shot of that tree, cut off right down to what we call a collar, but it's removed right back to the trunk. This is the kind of stuff we like to see in apple trees in particular. So in almost all cases, a branch should either be totally taken out or left alone. This tree, I give this talk in a lot of different venues, and there's a lot of things you could say about this really ugly mess of a tree. This is a tree that's too vertical. It's the variety, really. This is a McCowan tree, and they're known for growing kind of like Lombardy poplars. But you can see, as I'm trying to grow this tree down and trying to force the growth outward, horizontal, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, I'm never heading off a tree. So even here where I cut this shoot off, I'm allowing it to grow out here, and then even here where I'm trying, where this shoot was growing straight up, I cut it off here and force out the growth to the side. So you're always removing the entire branch and directing the growth to another area. That'll be more clear as we move ahead. So training and pruning are two different sides of the coin. So the training is the general shape that you are trying to go after, and some of the other techniques you might use to get there besides just pruning. Older style trees are often planted in this open vase system where you might have multiple trunks. I would call this and that and that and that and that different trunks. This was a way, when all trees were seedlings and were very large, this was a way to spread the growth out and allow sunlight penetration into the tree, and reduce how shaded and kind of congested things got in the center. This is not typically done anymore, except for on certain other non-apple species like peaches. It's often done on peaches where they have a very low tolerance for shading in the interior of the canopy. But more so, we're seeing some form of this central leader system. So central leader is hard to see here with these trees just loaded down with fruit, but you have a central trunk and I'll just pick one of those shoots to call the trunk, with the branches radiating out from that trunk. So that's the system that we typically are settled on now, and really all of the other systems that sort of come from this are just modifications of the central leader system. This is something I see so common in home orchards, where going the wrong route when you first plant that tree, or maybe a year or so later, makes for a really bad tree form. So if we follow the top path, we've got our tree that started out, it's got multiple branches, and when we first plant it, we select for a few, 2 or 3 relatively horizontal growing branches. And the next year, as they grow, we select a few more relatively horizontal growing branches with, windows in between that allow for sunlight and air to penetrate. When that tree grows full form, those branches will form permanent scaffolds that will make for a good, pleasing, strong tree shape. If we don't prune at all, or if we allow these uprights to grow tight, and we've got this tight congested area when the tree is very young, and we keep that, we end up with this mess where all that growth that came out from the same place early on creates this congested area where branches are growing together, and you have an area where you've got weak wood and moisture and areas where the tree where it's likely to have disease, and the tree just physically splitting apart. So following this step of selecting a few horizontal branches early on is really, really critical to having a successful tree for years. So here's a 3rd-year tree before and after, right? So you can see there's a fair amount of busy stuff that's in here on the left, and just a few cuts. Remember, this is a 3-year-old semi-dwarf tree, so these handful of shoots that we're looking at now are going to form the primary scaffold branches that we're going to grow fruit on for the next 15 or 20 or more years. We don't need to keep everything right now. We're just getting the tree formed together. One thing to think about, this is just a quick one I like to point out, but it's important to balance the tree in all 3 dimensions. So if you look down on a tree, just as much as you want the branches to be distributed, moving vertically throughout the tree, as you look down, you want them to be distributed around the perimeter of the tree as well. And that just ensures that you have a balanced tree that's not going to lean off and break off to one side. And this should be done early. So, you can, if you have no shoot on one side, you can watch for a small shoot that's forming. Or if you have 2 shoots on one side, cut one off as soon as possible and try to encourage another one to grow out as you're keeping that tree balanced throughout the perimeter of it. This kind of references that picture I showed of the years 1 through 3 early pruning. These tight crotch angles, we call them, are really problematic. So this happens with certain varieties. Macallan is one that we have to prune our way out of this. You can also spread your way out of this. So there's certain spreaders. These are little blocks of wood that might have a little nail poked into the either end to hold it in place. People might tie it down. You can see a piece of string here. It's tied down to spread the branches, but spreading branches, and if they're too tight, cutting whole branches right off is really important as early as you can do that, because these tight crotch angles, you have the bark from one branch growing into the bark of another branch, and it creates this weak spot in the tree. So it's really important to get your branches early on growing relatively horizontal, or at least 60-degree angle and not higher. So these are some of the things that you look for when pruning a fruit tree. Suckers. a true root sucker is coming from the root system. There's a vegetative shoot growing up out of the root system. These other things that we call suckers in the top of the tree are really water sprouts, but it's the same ideas. These vertical shoots that basically sap the growth out of a tree. So these you can remove really anytime. Anything broken, any stubs that are left over from a broken branch, or even some types of pruning in the summer. Say you're taking out a fire blight branch or something like that, or a damaged branch, and you left a stub. Get those out. Get stuff out that's pendant or growing down. Anything that's crossing over. So this is, these two branches are kind of crossing over each other. You want to have, one channel for the growth of the tree that can accept the sunlight. The leaves are basically solar panels. You want them spread out across a branch, and sunlight be able to get in there. So you don't want things crossed over a lot. You also don't want, interior branches. Now it's hard to see with no leaves on this tree, but that might be totally shaded out by trees, by branches above them. Those aren't really doing you much use. Competing leaders. So with the idea of the central leader is you want to have a single leader that goes up, that goes up, that channels the growth of the tree. I'll talk a little bit later about how to manage these, but typically we manage for one of these. And if the tree's getting too tall, you might, take it back to here and allow something else to become the leader. And then narrow crotches, I mentioned that earlier. So pruning every year really is the best practice. Not everybody gets to it, but if you want to maintain the best tree form, the best health of the tree, you should do a little pruning every year as opposed to heavy pruning every 3 or 4 or 10 years. I'm going to walk us through pruning a tree at this point. So here's a tree. This is a pretty busy tree. It's got good form. It's got a nice central leader. The scaffolds that are coming out are at good angles, but it's really too busy. So we're going to walk through, and I'll prune this off digitally. So first I come through and I prune the uprights, the water sprouts. Then I prune these extended shoots that are growing up and kind of creating too much mess and not allowing the light into the canopy. Take off the downward growing shoots. Take off a branch that's in between and really doesn't have enough access to sunlight because it's gets stacked up with branches above it. I'm trying to create what I call windows to the sky. More pendant shoots. Taking off more of those uprights in the top of the tree. Cleaning up a few of those shoots up top to encourage a single leader. And I've just pruned that tree. Just a few cuts. Dozen cuts, 15 cuts was enough to clean that tree up. So if we want to bring down the height of a tree, I mentioned that I was going to talk about this before when I was mentioning taking out competing leaders. It's important to not just come through and top a tree, come through with a saw and just whack the top off. You really need to channel the growth of that tree back into a leader. And so what we often do is cut back to a weak vertical shoot. So I'll walk through that with this tree. You see how we're leaving, wherever we cut, we're not leaving any stubs. You can see how I'm channeling that growth into that weakly growing leader. That leader will become more vigorous this season. And then if it gets too vigorous, you might cut back to another weakly growing leader. But you can see I'm taking whole limbs out, whole branches out. So these are thinning cuts they're not heading cuts, but they're thinning cuts that are used to just thin out the growth within that tree. These are those ugly, ugly trees that should have been trained better back when they were just a few years old. But sometimes you get these, you inherit these, or maybe you go out and you realize that the trees you have got this kind of mess at the center, sort of at the crown of them. This is where just making a few cuts and removing entire branches can really clean up a tree. And you can see a lot more windows to the sky. And that's all I would do for this particular year. you may need, obviously you'll need to come back next year when you get regrowth and you'll need to cut more pieces out, but just cutting out whole branches that will allow for access to sunlight and just an airy open canopy. Simple shot, reducing the width of a tree, again, cutting back to another shoot. You don't just head things off. This is a tree that it's actually a wild tree. It's not even a planted tree. Kind of a wildlife tree that a homeowner was interested in cleaning up, and he liked the fruit on it, so I offered to help him out. And you can see I go through the process, just a few cuts, open that up. I don't have pictures of the following year, but you would follow that process a few times, selecting more and more for the horizontal growing branches to turn it from that mess growing up in the center of all growing upright into a central leader tree with horizontal scaffolds. Here's a tree that's a commercial orchard seedling tree. This picture was taken quite some time ago, but still shows how you can grow a large tree, highly productive tree. This tree, I think, was 18 or 20 feet tall, produce a tremendous amount of fruit. A tree like this might produce 8 bushels of fruit or more, but is able to be maintained into a really airy, open growth form with regular pruning, regular training to maintaining a central leader with a relatively weaker top. You don't have the top of the tree overshadowing the bottom of the tree, and with nice relatively horizontal or maybe 60-degree branches. So this is a tree. I would love to see a tree like this in everyone's yards. With that, I'm wrapped up, and I'm happy to see everybody when we continue with the Q&A session for class. Thanks.